Problem on. Yep, we are recording. That's good. Stop. Yet this morning?
Having a lot of fun. It's
Okay.
been exciting so far.
Okay, well that's great, and we're rolling, so we're going to stop. Morning.
Good morning.
We're at the Palm Springs Air Museum on Veterans Day. Is this Veterans Day? This is Armistice, November 11th, and we're here to interview and document for the Palm Springs Air Museum, Library of Congress, of World War II veterans. Today our veteran is BERT McMILLAN, a captain from the Air Force, a P-47 driver, and a man who went through a terrible crash. BERT, would you please give us your name, the date you were born, and where you were born?
My name is BERT McMILLAN. Born November 17th, 1919 in Butler, Pennsylvania.
Thank you, and we thank Bob Andrade for being the cameraman and the very best librarian in the whole military history. Thank you. Could you tell us where your grandparents and parents came from?
As far as I know, my mother and father came from Germany and England. German and an English lady is something else.
And where did they settle, or where did you grow up?
I grew up in the hills of Pennsylvania. A little city by the name of Butler, 30,000 population, 30 miles north of Pittsburgh.
What are some of the first memories you have growing up?
The airplanes that were flying over my head when I was caddying at the Butler Country Club.
Do you remember what kind of planes they were?
I remember a tri-motor, number one, a lot of bi-wing airplanes, single engine of course, training planes at that time. I don't recall the names of them, that was 60-some years ago.
What did you do in like middle school? What do you remember about middle school? You remember any teachers or friends or?
The best teacher I ever had in middle school was my sister. She failed me in the 4th grade. I'll never forgive her. But she's a wonderful woman.
And what's her name?
Irene.
How many brothers and sisters do you have?
I have 3 brothers and 4 sisters.
Oh my gosh, name them if you.
Well, starting with Irene, the eldest, and Howard, second, Margaret, the third, Clifford, the 4th, I guess, Nora, Bert, myself, and my sister Madeline.
And what was your mom and dad's names?
My mother's name was Lena. My dad's name was Bert, Edward McMillan.
And what did he do?
Carpenter most of his life.
Okay. Did you participate in any sports in school and high school and on?
Oh, I played a little basketball, played a little football, and not to any great extent, but I played a little.
Were you aware that war was pending, and how did you feel about that?
It's hard to answer that. I knew the clouds of war were forming in Europe. There was a draft coming up. I knew I was going to be drafted. I knew I wanted to, if I went into the service, I wanted to be in the Air Force. So when I volunteered actually for the Air Force and was accepted and sent to Biloxi, Mississippi.
Where did you go to high school? What was it like in the community and the town? And
Well, Butler, Pennsylvania was where I went to high school. It was a pretty good sized school, two-story building, probably had 1,000 students at that time. It was 1939 I graduated.
Do you have favorite subjects in high school?
Drafting, number one. Woodworking, number two. Learned that, I guess, from my father. And the rest was just general routine studies that was quite difficult for me.
Did you, you had caddied, but did you have any other jobs when you were growing up?
I had a paper route when I was young and carried papers throughout our neighborhood. I had about 55, 60 customers at that time. We paid 2 cents for the paper and sold it for 3, so I had a 30% profit, which is great. You don't see that much today in business.
Were there any bad dogs on the paper route, or did you run into that?
Well, there were a few, but at that time, dogs didn't have to be on a leash, and they didn't have the restrictions we had today. So it seems like they were all quite friendly to us, the human beings, but boy, they sure got in some fights with each other.
Yeah.
Packs of them scared you.
I'm going to stop. Did you have a car, or did you get a car before you went into the service?
Yes, when I graduated from high school, most everyone was moving to Detroit, Michigan at the time, where they were opening the automobile industry once again. They didn't build cars after, I guess it was 1941 or 2 when we got into the war. But the first car I bought was a 27 Chevrolet Coupe. Paid $75 for it. Used car. Great little car.
Did you have it in high school?
I beg your pardon?
Did you have it in high school, or?
Oh, no.
Okay.
I drove a little. I got my driver's license when I was in high school. But cars were a premium, and they didn't let the teenagers have them as much as they do today.
Did you work before you were called into the service, or did you have a job? Did you start school again, anything else, or?
Yes, I worked at the Great Lakes Steel Corporation, principally as a laborman, and decided that if I'm going to be into the service, I'd better get an education. I went to classes at night in Detroit in hopes of passing my cadet exam when I did get into the service, so I could have pilot training. Fortunately, it turned out just exactly the way I wanted it.
Were there a lot of fellows doing that at the time? Did you know?
Yes, there's quite a few.
What was kind of the atmosphere? Again, this is before Pearl Harbor.
It wasn't too far before Pearl Harbor. I went in November with the Battle Creek, Michigan, and then they sent us to Biloxi to aircraft mechanic school. I was called then for cadet training.
Where were you on Pearl Harbor Day?
Biloxi, Mississippi.
What do you remember about it?
I remember the MPs driving up and down through the city streets, reporting for all military personnel to return to base immediately.
At that time, did you have a girlfriend or somebody you were writing to, or?
Oh, I think the usual girlfriend, we always joined the girls when possible. And no one in particular, but I enjoyed.
At camp, when they announced December 7th, what was the atmosphere then?
Tent city, slit trenches for latrines. Lots of food, lots of good food, lots of drill, lots of marching, the routine things that you do in preparation for boot camp.
And you went to boot camp in Biloxi?
Well, I would call it boot camp. We did awfully lot of marching, every morning, every night, every afternoon. So they kept us busy.
Were they wiping out guys at that point? Did they start qualifications to be a pilot, and then if you didn't reach
No,
that?
at that point, no, they didn't.
Okay.
It came later. I was probably 2 months into aircraft mechanic training, and then I was called to report to Kelly Field,
Where was Kelly Field?
Texas.
Okay.
Still there, blooming and big and beautiful.
Was that your first impression of it when you walked in as a cadet?
Actually, I didn't see the field for probably a week. We were in camps or in tents. But after we got assigned to groups and aircraft, why, yes. But still, we did no flying I didn't do any flying out of Kelly. They sent the first group to Bonham, Texas, which was not too far from San Antonio.
What were some of the things you did during your training at that stage? Kind of a typical day.
Well, we had the ground school half a day and flying half a day. We flew the PT-19As, low-wing monoplane, and it was pretty much routine. I'll never forget the first flight or the last flight at the bottom. It was quite interesting.
Tell us about the first flight.
That was my first time in the air. I mean, I've never been on an airplane before, and it was a cool, clear morning, clouds in the sky, nice fresh air, and I never saw the world so beautiful, at least a portion of the world.
Were you in the front seat or the back seat?
In the front seat.
You remember your instructor, what he told you or had you do or anything?
Well, he was probably one of the finest instructors on the field, I feel. The one thing that he did do, but did on occasion, if you made a mistake, you know, you're flying there with a stick between your legs, and if you made a mistake, that instructor, the sticks worked in unison, and they just beat your legs. You couldn't get away from that stick. Of course, it didn't bother the airplane, it's too fast in action.
Yeah.
That was our penalty for making mistakes. It was a good lesson.
Was it an hour or half an hour? Or?
Usually an hour and a half. We went out and did, of course, as we progressed, we get into aerobatics and so on, which was really exciting. Never forget my first spin. I don't think anyone ever forgets that first spin and the recovery. You compare that with a P-47 where you get a spin and a half and you better be ready to pull out. But so be it. I enjoyed it very, very much.
So the spin was your favorite aerobatic, or did you do loops and other
Oh
things?
yes, we did loops and figure eights and chandelles and emergency landings. That was always fun. They pull that throttle on you and say, get this thing on the ground, we're going to live through it. And fortunately, we're over a billiard table in the state of Texas, so we didn't have too much to worry about.
What about that plane? Were there any characteristics about it that you had to watch out for, or ground looping or anything like that?
Not PT-19A. It was a good little airplane.
What was your last flight like, you mentioned?
Well, I think it was pretty close to soloing. The instructor took me out, and we had a bad day. At least he told me we were having a bad day. And that's when he beat my legs a little bit with the stick. And we shot a few landings, and finally, after about the third landing, he said, pull this thing over here. If you want to kill yourself, go out and kill yourself. That was the way of telling you you're ready to solo. take off, bring the airplane around. I never made a better landing in my life. Took off again. Seemed like it took 2 days to get around to the field. And I can't figure out why this airplane isn't flying the way it should. I'll give it more throttle and work everything that I can think of in the cockpit and make my approach. And by then I'm a little bit excited and I hit the ground and bounce, and it was the worst landing I ever made in my life. What had happened, I didn't pull up my flaps when I took off from the first landing.
What did he say?
Well, he waved me over. First of all, he waved me around, and I shot a couple more landings, and he pulled me over, and he said, "You're ready."
And what were you ready for?
The next airplane, the BT-13A, the BT-13 Vol-T vibrator. Exciting airplane.
Well, describe it.
Shook and hammered, and a little more horsepower. I think we went to about 185 horsepower on that airplane, similar, something like that. And we get into night flying, and here again, aerobatics, they didn't encourage it too much because of the aircraft. It wasn't a good aerobatic airplane, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But here again, we got through the basic flying, or basic, yes, primary, basic, and then advanced to the SNJ, the AT-6 as we called it. That was a good airplane.
The previous airplane, was that open cockpit or was that enclosed?
No, it was open.
Okay.
PT-19A.
Yeah.
PT-13 had a canopy. So did the AT-6.
Okay. And what did you do in the AT-6? What kind of upgraded was that?
Well, I think that's where flying really began again. You get into real aerobatics, and that AT-6, you can do anything with it. Formation flying, simulated combat. We used to go up and two of us would fly together and separate and come back and have a simulated attack, and then see who could get on the other man's tail to raise a little havoc.
And where were you based when you started with the Texan?
That was in Sherman Field. It was only probably 15 miles from Bonham.
Okay.
Excuse me. That's where I had basic training. I went to Louisiana, Lake Charles, Louisiana, for my advanced training in the AT-6.
Yeah. While you were in training, do you remember anything that the conversation and what people were saying about what was going on in the war, or what you guys heard while you were in the process of getting ready?
Really, we were so damn busy, we didn't hear too much about what was going on, or we didn't pay much attention to it. We had problems of our own learning how to fly, and at the end of the day, we were pretty well worn out. And, I don't recall too much action, so to speak, in the discussion of the war.
Was there a wipeout ratio at like 1 out of 3 or something, or?
Well, in primary, they wiped out probably over 50%. In basic, it probably reduced to about 20 to 30%. Advanced training, very few. I'd say less than 10.
Do you remember any incidents or accidents, or like the toughest thing that you had to get through was being trained?
Yeah, that's pretty much so. It's true. We didn't have too many accidents in training, really. It was rare. The accidents began after we were assigned to a fighter squadron.
Okay. And what were your ties to home during training? Did you did you have any of your brothers go in, or?
I had a brother and a sister. There's 3 of us in a service at the same time.
Okay. And where were they, and what were they doing?
My sister was in I believe she was in Lake Charles or that vicinity somewhere. I visited her on occasion, and my brother was in the South Pacific.
Okay. Where in the South Pacific? You
Philippines.
Philippines. Was this the sister that flunked you in 4th grade?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, she's still teaching school.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, really.
She keeps claiming she didn't, but I think she did. I was held back for half a semester.
Oh. Well, that's... Okay, you're through basic now, and again, what are the 3 planes you flew in basic?
PT-19A, the BT-13, and the AT-6.
And what came next?
WWII P-40s was our assignment to the first group that I was assigned to. That's the only airplanes that were available to our squadron.
You used the term war-weary. What does that mean?
I think Chenault had them in China for quite a while. Some of them even had the flying tiger shark's teeth on it, the head. And it was quite an airplane.
How did, when you say quite an airplane, what are some of the things about it that you remember?
Well, I remember the first time I fired one up, the exhaust fumes come back around the cockpit, which engulfs you, and you wonder if you're going to come out of it, but that was just a temporary thing. The cylinders were charged and they fired and so on. First time I've ever felt or seen a 16 horsepower engine fired up. Secondly was the landing gear. If you could get that airplane off the ground and back on without ground looping it or tipping it over, you were very fortunate.
Did you ever do that?
No, fortunately I didn't. A lot of them did. We used to go down to the runway after we finished flying, watch those B-40s come in, and they would bounce on one wheel on another wheel, and pretty soon they're rolling off the edge of the runway and they're on their nose. They were something. And also the P-40, in a dive, you had to have a very, very strong left leg to combat the torque. Mm-hmm. That was quite an experience to roll it over and dive, and you hold that left rudder until it started shaking, and finally pull out. It was fun.
What kind of maneuvers did they teach you? Did they teach you that you were going to be against Germans or Japs or what? And the planes that you were going to fight?
Well, we had lots of sessions on the identification of friend and foe. A quick picture shown on a screen to identify it. We learned the outlines or the silhouette of the various airplanes was a big thing that they made us familiar with. In the flying itself, we get into high altitude flying. We flew ground gunnery, we flew formation. Formation was always a lot of fun. It's unbelievable that you can sit up there and fly wing to wing within inches of another airplane. It better not leave it though. You keep that eye glued on it all the time.
What's the eye glued on?
The wingman.
Well, what kind of armament did you have? What would the plane?
I don't recall what the P-40 had. We never had any ground gunnery with the P-40. P-39 had a cannon in the nose. I know. I flew P-39s and P-51s and 47s, but the armament on a P-40, I don't remember.
Okay. You used 3 pursuit planes there. Could you do a little comparison between the P-40 and you said the P-47 and the P-51? Is that?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, the P-39.
Yeah, the P-39 was, it was a rough airplane starting. I mean, whenever you fired the airplane up, it would shake for 5 minutes before it settled down. The engine was operating fine. It was known to tumble in extreme cases because it was so overbalanced, I feel. The engine was behind you and the guns and the prop and so on right in front. I never had the experience of tumbling, but I understood a lot of them did. The P-63 came next. They extended the aircraft 6 feet and corrected all those problems. It was a beautiful airplane. They sent all those to Russia.
Could you describe tumbling in more detail?
Well, if you get in there, they get the airplane in a certain position, in a stalling position, sometimes it would go over before it would drop off on a wing. Most airplanes, whenever they stall, it'll fall off in one wing or the other. But being on the center of gravity, if you're trimmed forward or whatever the case may be, it may tumble on it. They warned us of this, but I never saw one actually do it.
Was that like a full circle? I mean, it would tumble all the way around?
End over end.
Oh, and how'd you get out of that?
I don't know. I don't know if they did.
Okay, yeah. And then between the 3 planes, did you have a favorite one, or was there?
Well, I haven't even mentioned the P-51. It was the sweetheart of them all.
Yeah.
I mean, the P-47 was a great airplane. After they revised the canopy and modified it to come out with a new model with a bubble canopy, it was a great airplane. I mean, it would carry a bomb load. It would carry a lot of fuel. You had a bubble canopy. You had fuel injection. You have automatic pilot and everything you can imagine in the aircraft today it had at that time. And those were the airplanes that were assigned to us ready for combat.
Did you ever fire the cannon? Did you ever have any ground?
No, not on
Okay.
the P-39s.
Okay. And then you graduated, or when did you get your assignment to your squadron? And was that P-47s first, or was that after the P-40s?
That was a P-40.
Okay.
We got the P-40s first, then the P-47s come in. That was our airplane assignment to the ship overseas.
What training would you go through to get a new plane, to go from a P-40 to a P-47?
Flying airplanes are kind of like riding a bicycle. Basically, they're all the same, but you have to go through a cockpit check, usually a blindfold check for the cockpit, and simulators. We didn't have a simulator for the P-47 at that time. However, we did have simulators just for instrument flying. Almost forgot the question.
No. Do you have any additional P-40 memories?
No, not really. We didn't have them too long. When we were assigned to the squadron, we flew to New Hampshire to pick up our airplanes. The last group, evidently, that shipped out of New Hampshire. We went up there in the dead of winter, and man, it was cold, and the snow was packed on each side of the runways. And took off on those P-40s, flying them back to Richmond, Virginia. It was quite a thrill. We went into New York, I believe it was a LaGuardia. There's 17 of us in the flight. And when you started your landing procedure, you'd open the cockpit when you were in a pattern and a downwind leg and so on. And we landed, and I didn't anymore walk in the operations officer, and a police officer walked in and said, "Is there Bert McMILLAN here?" And I said, "Yes, what happened?" He said, "Something fell out of your airplane whenever you were out coming over the field, or downwind leg, or whatever he said, down the street probably. And the bag fell in front of us. We opened, found your name, and saw you land, so we brought it out to the airport. Strange happening.
What was it?
It was the only thing you could carry your clothes in was a duffel bag and a fighter. You know, you take one shirt and a pair of slacks with you. You never know when you're gonna, how long you're gonna be at. But that was quite an experience.
Well, how did it fall out?
The wind suction. The minute you throw that canopy back, why the wind
Okay,
would take it.
that's great.
Then, of course, we continued our flight, 17 of us. We had our flight commander with us, and we said that he called us all before we went into our home base at Richmond. He said, we're going in line astern, and we're going in at tower height, and we're going to give the guys a thrill. We've got all their airplanes for them. So we go in, we peel off, and we land the airplanes and taxi them in. The commanding officers wait. Unfortunately, he fined the flight leader about 1 month's pay for pulling such a stunt. We weren't supposed to be doing that. So we all pitched in and paid his fine for him. Nothing was ever done about it.
Then you moved on to the P-47.
And the P-47.
Tell me about that plane.
First airplane arrives at Richmond, Virginia. Flight commander gets in it, takes it off, circles the field, telling everybody that it's the greatest airplane he ever flew, and come in, forgot to lower the landing gear. Brand new airplane, here it is, the middle of the runway, and the props were turned out. It's 4-bladed, 16-foot bladed prop, and they're turned out instead of in, which you would think. That was quite a thrill. That was very embarrassing.
I imagine he was replaced.
Not to my knowledge. What they did, the commanding officer had a plaque made up, and he had the assembly of the landing gear handle mounted on it, and he had to wear the thing night and day for a week, everywhere he went. That was his severe penalty, I guess. Had to do something, have fun.
And what squadron was that, and how many people were in that?
Oh, we had 3 different flights, 3 different red, yellow, and green nosed airplanes, different flights. I think it was the beginning of the 9th Air Force. The 8th had already shipped over to England. So I would say, if I recall, it's 147th wing that I was assigned to. Memories.
Yeah. Well, now let's lead up to your most exciting event in the Air Force, if it was that. Was this the time about that happened, or had you moved on to more advanced training?
No. Well, we went through the full training for combat into P-47. I mean, we had altitude flying and wing formation flying and everything in the books. We had aerial gunnery, a lot of aerial gunnery. We had ground gunnery, and after, I would say, I flew the airplane for probably 6 months. When I get into flying ground gunnery, and when we fly ground gunnery, the airplane had 8 50 caliber machine guns. We only used 2 for ground gunnery. No point in wasting all that ammunition. But still, whenever you would dive at a target at 300 miles an hour and open fire, you could feel the airplane vibrate. And I think this is what caused my accident in general. But we went through everything in the books for combat training.
Yeah. In aerial combat, did you fire actual dummy bullets, or how could you judge
Cameras. We had cameras.
Okay.
And you'd be surprised the number of footage come back and never saw an airplane in it. A lot of them were mine, too.
Yeah.
You think you've got right in your gun sights, but for some reason he's moving and you're moving, and you get a lot of blue sky, and every once in a while you catch a wingtip or maybe a whole airplane, which meant probably a hit.
Yeah. What were you doing when the accident happened? What were you working on?
It was my last 100 rounds of ground gunnery, as I recall. I was flying with a friend of mine by the name of A.J. McMILLAN. Two of us took off to fire 100 rounds and then come back and start packing. We lined up in the runway, all of us took off in formation, and we were given the clearance and took off, and just before I'm ready to leave the ground, my canopy flew back, and I stopped, turned around, which was a common thing. A lot of it happened a lot to all the pilots. Turned around, come back, got clearance again for takeoff, and what you did is slam the canopy back, forward, make sure it's locked, pull your weight up against it, and take off. And normally that was sufficient until you fired or wrung the airplane out in spins or something of that sort. But the canopy, I was making my last pass at the target and opened fired, and the last I remember was flying through the air, semi-conscious. The ground crew come over, and here I am laying in the swamp, seats, shoulder straps, parachute, everything intact. I'm laying there in the ground, both legs broken, a few minor cuts on my head. Other than that, I didn't have any other injuries.
What happened? Did you eject from the plane, or how did your seat? How did you and the seat all get out?
Well, you're indicating about 300 miles an hour, and you fired 150 yards. The airplane's really moving, and when a canopy hits you, you have no control. And I just went straight in landed on the wing and the engine, and it disintegrated, threw me clear. The biggest part of that airplane was the Pratt Whitney engine number 1. You can never tear it up, no matter if you shot it full of holes. And I guess I was the second biggest object.
Good gosh. And so, what's the history from there on? What happened?
After a year in the hospital, getting R&R, I was assigned to the 8th Air Transport Command. And that's surprising too, because I wanted to stay in the Air Force. They wanted to give me a medical discharge. I told them I'd prefer to stay in the Air Force. The retirement board said, well, if you do, you're going to have a desk job. And I said, well, if I have a desk job, then I'll get out. Or I'd like the opportunity to fly. And they said, well, give it a try. So they sent me down to the military field, the 36th Street Airport in Miami. Told me to check in operations. We'll call in advance and tell them you're coming and assign an airplane to you. What did they give me? An L-5 Cub to fly. So, took the airplane, I took off, and I flew all over Miami for as long as fuel held out, come back in and landed, went back and met with the retirement board, and they said, we'll put you back on flying duty, restricted to the continental limits. So they assigned me to the Air Transport Command. That's where I get into flying all types of aircraft. Anywhere there was an airplane needed, anywhere in the country, we were assigned to pick it up and deliver it, and then wait for the next assignment.
And what were some of the planes that you flew?
The first ones were the AT-6. I flew 3 or 4 of those to West Point. They were training at West Point at the time in AT-6. The P-47, the P-51, flew P-51s mostly because that was the airplane that was going into combat, and they had a lot of them. They had to get to New Jersey and moved overseas. P-39, the P-63, a little bit of everything. I never did fly the P-38. I checked out in it, cockpit check, but I was assigned to another airplane after I got the destination, after they sent us to wherever we were to pick the aircraft up.
Were there women involved in that at that time, or was that a totally separate transport? I know a lot of them flew delivered planes and overseas and stuff.
Yes, they did. In fact, that was about the only assignment they had, really. Cochrane's the only one I know of that had went into the war zones, so per se. Yeah, the women seemed to always want to outdo the men, and I can understand there was a competitive force working there. As an example, if we picked up an airplane, and I picked up 51s here in California and fly them to Newark, they would always get there maybe a day ahead of us. They pushed the weather a little bit, and they should have, and they did certain things that just put a competitive spirit in the delivery, is what it amounted to. And it was fun. They were great gals. I flew with a lot of them, equal to the men in my opinion, and were certainly needed.
Can you remember any particular incidents that happened during all of your flying career while you're in the air? Did you have any motors conk out or emergency landings?
I think every pilot, if he didn't have an emergency, he's never flown. I've dead stick to P-47 from 10,000 feet out of fuel. Unfortunately, whenever I finally woke up, I was on the runway and the prop was still windmilling, and I reached down and selected my tanks, and I had 300 gallons of fuel aboard. I had exhausted my emergency.
Wow.
Head up and locked.
Jeez.
But fortunately, I was over the field, and the P-47 doesn't glide too far, too fast, but I had plenty of opportunity to get it down. It was no problem. I've seen some accidents I didn't like to see. I flew with a lot of daredevils that I didn't like to see either. But there's all types.
Yeah. What was characteristic of a daredevil? How could you give a guy a name for that? What dumbbell things?
I don't know. We needed them too. Believe me, they'd do anything. They did more things an airplane would do that they shouldn't have done. We've all done that. I've done it myself. I don't consider myself a daredevil, but I was very cautious.
And were you aware of what was happening in the war at the time? Did any of that?
Pretty much so, yeah. We were getting reports back from the group that was kind of ahead of us, the 8th Air Force. And, they didn't have the they didn't have the P-40s whenever they got it. I don't know what they were flying over there. But we were the first group to get the P-47 airplane. And reports weren't good. You know, you could get all kind of reports, but you don't pay much attention to them.
Yeah. Well, you remember where you were in Pearl Harbor Day on December 7th. Where were you when the war came to an end, from your standpoint?
I was sent to Hawaii. Why I was sent to Hawaii, no one ever knows, because it's stated right on my military records that you're restricted to the continental limits. Hawaii was not a state at that time. When I arrived, the commanding officer there said, "What in the hell are you doing here?" And I said, "That's what I told the commander at Long Beach, I was restricted. He said, well, Hawaii isn't a restriction, you're going. He thought I was trying to get out of it. I wasn't. I really wanted to go.
Okay.
So that was what we did in Hawaii, was fly weather missions in B-17s. Here I am, a fighter pilot, sitting in the right seat of a B-17, and I don't know what's going on. Well, I do basically, but I don't know where all the switches are. So it was primarily fly out at 500 feet, give a weather report, same weather, visibility 70 miles in haze, you know, over the Pacific. But most of us were just getting our flying time in to be mustered out.
You know, you mentioned the radio and communications. And how many years was that total? That was probably 3 years, 4 years?
From 41 to 47.
Did you see improvements in communications or anything that particularly you were grateful to see in a plane at the end of your services versus the beginning?
Well, we didn't have the Omni at that time. All we had was the beam, so to speak, where we had N and A signals, where it's hard to describe to the layman how it operated, but there's a beam going, let's say, north and south and east and west. And they had 2 A zones and 2 N zones. You know you were in the N zone approaching, or if the signal faded, the signal faded out. That's the only communications that we had radio-wise for directional finding.
Bert, here's your favorite plane, I believe. Can you tell us some of the features of it?
Well, this is the original P-47D, I believe, was the proper P-47D. The revision of this airplane was the P-47DRE, remodeled, that's the way I remember it. But first of all, it had a 16-foot bladed prop Pratt Whitney engine, 2,000 horsepower, 4 50 caliber machine guns. This is a fuel tank, probably will handle 100 gallons or so. This airplane burned between 75 and 100 gallons an hour and carried 300 gallons of fuel and 15-minute reserve and a reserve tank. I'll never forget that reserve tank. But the canopy here it's called a Razorback because of the shape of it. And this complete assembly from here back was, the canopy would roll back. At this point, there was a latch and a bar that would open the canopy, and so you could slide it back to get in and get out of the airplane. It had a reflective gun sight where you had to raise the seat to look through the gun sight because it were reflective on the windshield, and you couldn't see unless you were really lined up right on it. That's what caught me whenever I was diving at the ground target and the canopy let go and hit me on the head. Mm-hmm. Glad to be here. Other than that, there isn't much I can say about it. The radio equipment was average.
What were its big features? Did it climb faster, or was it designed to? Okay.
Number one, it's turbocharged, which means you could put an injection of water into those cylinders and it would increase the horsepower considerably, giving you additional speed and elevation climbing. It would climb like a homesick angel. It was that airplane, it just seemed like it would hang on that prop forever before it would start dropping back. comfortable, big. They finally used it for strafing, I understand, more than high altitude flying, for which it was designed. It was a high altitude flyer. I've been up there over 30,000 feet with it, and there's no one up there to fight. So they use it for ground gunnery and bombing a lot. Other than that, it's just a real good airplane. I loved it.
How about life after the service? Did you come home and get married, or where did you start to work, and what all happened there?
Well, I was married when I was in the service. I can recall that I was going to have my wife join me in Hawaii when I was stationed there after the war. However, I decided to take my discharge and meet her in San Francisco and start life again.
Who was that, and where was she from, and how did you meet her?
Well,
And her name?
I met her in Dallas when I was in the Air Force, and she was working at Neiman Marcus at the time. We just happened to meet and clicked. Still with me today.
And her maiden
60
name?
years later.
Oh, excuse me. Her maiden name?
Inez was her maiden name. Her last name was Alexander. Great gal.
Okay. And you said 60 years.
60 years.
That's great.
And holding.
Yeah. Each other, I hope. So, what was your first job out of the Air Force?
I went into construction with my brother. It was in Seattle. He was building buildings and bridges and etc. and asked me if I wanted to go to work for him, and I said, I've got to do something. Let's give it a go. But I wasn't too stable on my feet. I didn't know how long it would last.
Was that from the
join him.
legs, the accidents in the legs?
We're working in the rain most of the time in Seattle and working on bridges, and I just didn't feel like I could handle that too much longer. Under those circumstances, I was taking a chance on those legs. So I got into the sales market. Joined a group selling boom trucks and aerial devices. Was assigned a territory of 11 states and 2 provinces in Canada, setting up dealers. Those products today you see all over the world. Aerial devices for trimming trees and working on transformers and transmission lines. And some of them go as high as 175 and 200 feet down. It certainly has improved the working abilities of the power companies, particularly where a man doesn't have to climb poles all day long and get very little done. Now he can stand in a stable platform, do a day's work, and feel comfortable and safe. I set up dealers, and everyone I set up seemed to be having a nice lifestyle, and I thought, well, perhaps I can get a distributorship and join the ranks. So I was given a distributorship in a 4-state area of Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri. And traveling in a car I didn't like. I loved to fly. I leased an airplane and started selling my products out of my airplane.
What kind of a plane was it?
Well, I started out with a Bonanza, and no, the first airplane was a Cessna 182. Good airplane. Loved it. Boy, real great airplane. Then I went to the Bonanza. It's a great airplane also. Had a second Bonanza and then a third. flew for 20 years later on my own aircraft in my own company, and had a lot of fun. Had a good job, and I owned the company. Come and go as you please in an airplane is a great living. I really loved it. Sold the company and retired.
And children, grandchildren, and their names? If
I have one daughter and 2 grandchildren. I have an adopted son.
And how did you get to the desert?
How did I get to the desert? I was on vacation. Any time I would go on vacation, it would turn out to be a golfing vacation. They had a tournament in Las Vegas, which our club in Kansas City joined every tournament they had, and we'd stay an extra week and come into La Quinta, play golf, and return to Kansas City. So I finally retired permanently here at La Quinta.
If you were speaking to a group of young people, let's say high school, what would you like them to remember about World War II in our country?
I don't know if I'd like for them to remember any of it. No one wins in a war.
Okay. Well, it's been a privilege to interview you, and on behalf of the Palm Springs Air Museum, we want to thank you for your service time and your representative of the greatest generation. And I know you feel like all the fellows here. You didn't do anything. You just did your job. But boy, what a job. So, Captain McMillan, we thank you very much.
I'm happy to be here.